everyone, and welcome to the Art of the News, Comics Journalism, an exhibition for the JSMA Museum. I'm joined here today by my co-host, Dave Sanyal.
Hey everyone, we are incredibly grateful to have as our guest for today's interview, Syrian-Canadian writer, researcher, critic, and comics journalist, Yazan Al Saadi. How are you today, Yazan?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited for our conversation. I just want to say it's a great day because I survived Beirut for another day. So that's always a great day.
Yazan, to get things started, let's begin at probably one of the most oft-asked questions you might have faced, which is, what brought you to journalism and how did you become involved with comics journalism?
Let's answer the first question. What brought me to journalism actually was the British financial crisis of 2008, when the world's financial systems collapsed and had a meltdown. I was doing my master's. I had completed my master's in SOAS in London. And I was looking for work. So when the world capitalism stopped working, as we know it would, it was hard to find a job. So I had to go back. I had to leave the UK because they wouldn't renew my visa. So I ended up going back to Kuwait, where my family is at. And I was looking for work there. And in the midst of looking for work, I had a friend that worked in an English print daily newspaper. He was one of the editors. So he brought me on board, and that's how I fell into journalism, thanks to the world financial collapse of 2008. And I just kept on doing it since then. I was working in that newspaper as a journalist and an editor, and then I started writing for Al-Akhbar English, which is a Lebanese-based news site. It's an offshoot of a quasi-leftist newspaper in Lebanon. So I was writing from there, from Kuwait to them. And then I decided to move to Lebanon 10 years ago, and I've been dabbling in journalism ever since. Now, how did I bring in comics into this? I mean, I'm a comic fanatic. I was raised on comics. My mom actually gave me a couple of comics when I was younger. I was reading Asterix and, well, I don't know if it was reading, because when you're young, you're just looking at the pictures. But let's call it reading. I was reading Asterix and Obelix, Tintin, Superman comics. But we're talking about the Superman comics that were translated into Arabic. So it's like from 1960s, 1970s. Friends of mine, as I was growing up in Kuwait, gave me manga. So I actually had Fist of the North Star, the manga of Fist of the North Star in Japanese. So I grew up around comics, and I was very interested in this medium, and I continued to be. So anyways, doing my career in journalism and research and other things, in 2017, I'm friends with comic creators in Lebanon. So one of them actually is like, here's an opportunity. We have a friend that works in the NIB. Why don't you pitch him something? We can retool something into a comic. So I took that opportunity. I was like, hell yeah, I'd like to try to do that. And that's how we got the first comic that was published in the NIB in 2017 with Ghadi Ghusm, who's an artist, a phenomenal artist that I continually work with from time to time. And that one is called The Rubble is Universal, about when I went to Yemen. When I was working with MSF, I was in Yemen at the time for about 3 weeks in 2016. This was during the American elections, which I have to say, being in a country like Yemen, when the 2016 American elections happened, is really a unique experience. It was a brilliant experience. But anyways, yeah, that's how I got into comic journalism. So ever since 2017, I kept on working and publishing different stuff, mainly with the NIB, and tried other things as well. Because I love the medium, and I think the medium is a phenomenal tool to convey information. It's a great weapon of storytelling. And yeah, it just combines a lot of my guilty pleasures, you know? It's how to sum up a long story short, you can blame the 2008 financial crisis and just loving comics as a child.
Can you tell us a little bit about your methods and your working practices, both as a journalist, so documenting and reporting, then also as a comics journalist, so collaborating with Khari and Omar Khoury and Tracy Chawan? What is that process like for you?
So the type of journalism that I got into, because I come from a weird background, I fell into journalism. I didn't go into journalism school where they teach you these basic rules and protocols. So the type of journalism that I was already doing was long form, narrative, odd stories. So I would look for stories that were just different. So a lot of stuff I would write about, for example, was outing Scientologists in Lebanon and how they functioned, looking at the history of science fiction in the Arab world, looking at horror in Arabic cinema, then writing about Palestine, writing about Syria and politics and elections. So I keep on switching. So I don't follow the rules generally, and I know that's a terrible thing to say. It's a terrible thing to say, but I don't follow the rules in terms of it's not about the daily news to me. It's something that is a story that I find is just odd, and I just want to go into that. It's niche. It's something that I try to highlight. I try to mix in a lot of my different backgrounds because I was never a journalist student. I did study economics and international law. And obviously, because of who I am and my identity, I have to know politics. So I bring everything into what I write. So a lot of my journalism isn't your simple news. It's trying to bring in so many themes and ideas and mixing it together. So when it comes to comic journalism, I try to continue that tradition of bringing so many different sources and ideas, where I try to talk about a certain story, but I also try to universalize it. So I don't know if you noticed in a lot of the comics I did with the nib, I would talk about certain things, but I also try to remind the reader, this isn't just over there. This is over here. There are shades here. Because, this is because of who I am and my identity and my experience as an Arab who has a Canadian passport and who lives in the region. And obviously, the experiences of the media or discourses on the region, its people, its history to date is problematic, as everyone knows, right? From Orientalism to ideology to all that. So a lot of my writings is, to push back, not just in terms of a reactionary kind of way, but a provocative kind of way, to use the certain ideas and tools and upend them to create unity, to point out that, there isn't us versus them, but it's us, the lay people, versus the rich, the elite, those in power, because I don't think it's just defined by a border. This is a universal problem we're all facing in different ways. So that's what I try to really bring in the table, right? When I write anything. So I try to mix it up, match it. And that's what I try to do with the comic journalism, use so many sources and try to build unity or build universalism and bridges from particular stories that I come across.
You have briefly touched upon it already. So why would you think that comics is an effective medium for the kind of reportage that you're doing, for the kind of documenting the sort of stories that you report?
Anyone that works or sees the medium gets it, Alan Moore talks about the power of this medium, or Grant Morrison, or Joe Sacco. So many people point it out, and it's true, because the medium, by using visual and text, is activating, so many parts of a person's brain. The reader is very active in the process, and the information is absorbed. So I understand comics as a weapon, and I use that term very seriously. It is a weapon, and it's a weapon being used by states and corporations. So we should be using it. Think about, I know that after, the American invasion, occupation of Iraq, there was a lot of push by the US military and the US government to invest in comics, right? To the Arab people, winning hearts and minds, which is a perversion of, this amazing medium for, let's quote unquote, call it ill good or evil, whatever you want to call it. And I mean, we should be using this weapon. We should be using it, our weapon, to make statements, to push narratives, to push ideologies. Because, and I think we all can agree, the current, situation throughout the world is dire. It's dire not only in terms of economics, but climate change, warfare, increased exploitation, livelihoods. The patriarchy is going quite nuts, just the growth of fascism, the growth of right wing. So there is something urgent here. There's something very urgent for all of us. And I think comics are a weapon to push our discourses. One of the things I like to talk about, or I joke around, is that in 2011, when the Arab uprisings began, a lot of the battle happened in the material world, right? The realm of material. It's about, bread, butter, politics, elections. But we really are forgetting the battle in, the immaterial world, the thoughts, ideas. And this is a battle that for too long is in the hands of, people with power, people like governments or corporations that push a certain type of ideology that is about the status quo, or it really undermines our potentiality as human beings. So I think all these strands really push it. And the more I work with the medium, the more I'm a believer and I consume it. I consume the medium very well. Like, I love reading comics from every type. And I see its power. The thoughts that I have, or a lot of my personal political development, does owe to really sometimes the dumb stories that really have profound messages. And the way that it's conveyed just is interesting, more so than I would say a text alone or an art piece alone. So all these strands, I think, is an opportunity for us. And by the sheer fact that, I'm dabbling in this medium and we're having this conversation, we're actually having a conversation where you're asking me these questions. It just shows you the power of the medium.
To get even more into the specifics of what you're describing in terms of this weapon that is maybe multivalent, writing about Charlie Hebdo, you made this point that the argument for freedom of speech and freedom of the press should not and must not place aside the question and understanding of privileges and differing power dynamics that are at work. So what are some of the specific ways in your own work that you try to foreground and engage with these power dynamics and differentials?
So in my own work, I recognize the privileges and power dynamics I have, right? As a witness and as a person who has a Canadian passport that gives me access, that gives me, certain protections per se, more than other people. And I come from an economic class that is, let's say, middle class, right? Upper middle class. So I already have these privileges. And you can add more to it, my male gender in a world that is the way it is plays a part. So I try to recognize that. For me, I try to listen more in terms of the subjects or what I'm doing. I also try not to mince words, and I try not to be diplomatic when I'm trying to make a point, because I am not objective, and I don't think I should be objective. There is this constant philosophical discussion, especially in the American media educational system, about the primacy of objectivity. But objectivity is a privilege, and it is the position of power. It is very easy to be objective when you're not being affected, And I think objectivity allows for a lot of problems. And the fact is, Edward Said once said, and I agree with it, facts do not speak for themselves. They need to be coded in a socially acceptable narrative. And that's part of it, the narrative that I want to pursue, and I'm not objective, is the narrative that I pursue, right? Where I talk about people versus power. I'm not diplomatic in terms of the wrongs that I see, and I think I try to, think about my privileges also, right? I really try to center that, not center it in the narrative, but also center it within myself to be like, wait, is this correct? Am I? So these things. And what I try to do as well is, I mean, just going back to the previous question you had about the process of working with an artist is also, I try to have a collaborative process, right? I'm flexible in the script. Like I write the script, I write the idea, the layout of the panel that I have in my head. But if the artist comes with, a complete revision, I'm sold, you know what I mean? I'm not like very sacred about the text I write. I'm willing to throw it away or rework it if it's not making sense, or that collaborative system, which I think is also part of what makes comics so cool, is that collaborative process where you really need to work together, whether it's you and the artist, you and the editor, and whoever else is involved. And if you don't work together, it's a disaster. So I think that process as well really creates a sort of nice idealism because you're working together as a team to produce something. So I think that all really plays into just how I'm trying to work in this medium and really trying to account for my privileges and my forms of power and try to use it against those that are much more powerful and are getting away with what they're doing. Now, you brought the example of Charlie Hebdo, and I wrote against Charlie Hebdo after the attack, and obviously the attack is horrendous. But Charlie Hebdo is a problem because it is part of power. It is not, it's not from a community of vulnerability punching up. It was punching down, and it constantly does punch down, regardless if it's a Muslim or the queer community, or something that isn't part of what they view as the normal French society, which is white, secular, and a certain type of secular liberalism. Everything else is, but that's the power, that's really where they're coming from. So I think Charlie Hebdo isn't a good example, at least to me, with using their power and punching up. And I try to remind myself, with my work that I'm punching up. If I ever punch down, then I should get called for it and be punched. I should get a nice wallop on my face, and I would deserve it.
So you as you're talking about power differentials, and you mentioned Saeed, as a journalist, what are some of the biggest and or most recurring challenges that you face in engaging with and countering the prevalent misperceptions or misunderstandings about West Asian nations, communities, and people, especially in the American and Canadian, even Canadian media? So this is a long question, but yeah.
I try to counter it by, I think one of my favorite types of tools is using a cliche and upending the cliche they have, or the trope, and I try to play with that. But I also try to just speak, my voice as clearly as possible, and the voices around me, and say, this is what's going on. And like I said, I try to speak in very clear, direct words rather than, taming it or being diplomatic, to call a spade a spade. It's racism, it's settler colonialism, it's genocide, these things, using these terms, because I think has to be that shock, that sense of uncomfortableness that particularly readers in the United States should have because of the role of, their state in my region for centuries. I mean, this history is a long history. I mean, the first time I believe that the Americans had a foreign naval expedition was with the Barbary Wars, and that was in North Africa. So there's a history there. It's not something new, and there's an onus. I argue for the long game. I argue for accountability and reparations. Reparations when this happens. And I think because there is still to date an active role of the US state in my region, and they're not the only one. And this is something that I also try to point out, because the problem with the American audience in particular is this sort of polarization in a lot of the discussions, right? In one end, you have the typical Orientalism, neoconservative style of, oh, look, the savages need to be civilized. On the other end is the campus leftist position that any sort of movement is all a conspiracy led by US and Western imperialism alone. And there's no such thing as a dictatorship or, Russian imperialism, which, from my position, that's not true. Clearly there are imperialisms. So that's really how I try to engage, like try to just be direct and try to, but is it working? I don't know. I mean, it's a conversation I continually try to have, and it's something I try to think about. Is it worth doing? I don't know. And I know when I say, is it worth doing? Because the question is, should I just be writing comics for Arab audiences and ignore everyone else? But it's an ongoing conversation I have. But I am also idealistic, and I think, no, I should just have this conversation with whoever and just talk. This is basically what I know. These are the things, and this is the topics. And bully to the way your media presents it, but this is what's going on from our perspective.
I'm actually then, as a follow-up, going to just ask, because you write for many different outlets and your work has been featured on a number of programs around the world. So who is your intended audience? Who are you most hoping to reach with your writing and with your work, and why?
I'm going to answer it by saying the worst answer possible, which is I want anyone. I mean, it's like screaming in the dark, right? Because of how dire the situation is. I just want anyone that's interested, that can hear, that most importantly, I think my favorite audience member is the one that reads what I wrote and reads more. It starts opening up doors, asks questions, and does their research and reads the plethora of other works on the topic, whether it's on Palestine or Yemen or Bahrain or Syria, where the buck doesn't stop with me, and it should never stop with me. That's the type of audience I want. It doesn't matter if they live in Minsk or in Mumbai or in Johannesburg. It's anyone that can, like, if it's in the language they can read, which if it's in English, if they read English, and it just gets them to think, open up, or looks into it more, or has a connection. Because like I said earlier, it's not only when I write, for example, about Bahrain, it's not only about Bahrain, it's about Bahrain and the region and the world. Because I really truly have a perspective that as human beings, we're very connected, and the systems of repression are super connected, and they're coordinating like crazy. So that's the type of audience I want. Anyone that just wants to read and wants to know. And it doesn't matter, any age group, doesn't matter.
Tell us a little bit about your major inspirations and or artistic influences. Are there any particular graphic journalists or comic artists whose work pushed you towards, bringing together journalism and comics? And are there any particular bodies of work which you want to respond to, as in, this is something that has not been always correctly put, but I want to think about it and I want to develop around that narrative?
So I'm a comic scripter. I'm a comic writer through and through. I can't draw at all, to my utter shame. So I'm a rare breed of being, I joke, the only comic scripter in the Middle East, because everyone else draws and writes. So for me, my sources that really, got me into the medium or thinking about it, if we're looking at comics, obviously Joe Sacco, right? Joe Sacco is the groundbreaker, the person that really developed this idea of comic journalism. And I had the utmost pleasure of actually meeting him in person back in, I believe, 2014 when he visited. And it was an awesome experience. Just, you know how they say, never meet your heroes? But I say, you know, sometimes it's great to meet your heroes and get them drunk, because then it's amazing. You know, it's amazing to see Joe Sacco just having a good time, and you're like, yeah, cool. So obviously Joe Sacco, and just the way he comes about it, right? He's not objective. He is biased. He really presents it as stark as possible, and I love that clarity. So that definitely got me. That shaped, you know, the way that I wanted to be very clear and direct. And the other writer that really, like, I'm fascinated by, and I'm fascinated by their work, is Grant Morrison, who is just an oddball, like a complete, like the different spectrum. And for me, what Grant Morrison at least brings to me is this idea of not being afraid to add, you know, the spice, to really use different sources, to bring it into a larger message, the universalities of it. So trying to balance between, you know, the zaniness or the madness that Grant Morrison brings on the table, and the really rough, grounded realities that Joe Sacco brings to the table, and just trying to figure out how to balance between both. I think those are the two that really come to mind. What was the second part of the question? Or I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, it's basically, are there any particular bodies of work which you want to respond to in terms of?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of bodies of work that are worth responding to in terms of what has been written about, you know, the West Asian, North African region, whether in the news or in fictions. So I try to think about that. Obviously, the types of journalism I do is a natural response to the reportage and things that, you know, comes out of Fox News and CNN and all those in between. And I'm also trying to think, at least in terms of fictions, right? So the types of work that I'm currently trying to do is really rehabilitate certain Arab figures that were vilified in Western fictions. So I'll give you two examples that I've been thinking about. One is Lovecraft's Mad Arab, the person who wrote the Necronomicon. So when you read about like that short, very, very short thing that Lovecraft, who, as you all know, is a crackhead racist, but also has done some really interesting things on horror. So his little spiel about the Mad Arab, the author of that Book of the Dead, is this crazy Orientalized Arab. So I was thinking of reimagining that character as a tragic hero. Why not? You know, like that history is not understood, and it's enshrined in, you know, the magic and the spirituality that was in the region that isn't a bad thing. So playing with that. The other character that I was thinking of trying to rehabilitate is, as the Americans like to say, Jafar in Aladdin, because Jafar is actually a very interesting historical character. I don't know if people are aware, he was a vizier to Harun al-Rashid. He comes from a family who were Buddhists that converted to Islam, and he was very wise. So it's looking, and he had a tragic history because he ended up being beheaded by Harun al-Rashid over supposedly a romance with Harun's sister. So there is a lot of interesting, see, like, yeah, I saw your eyebrows go up. I mean, it's a beautiful, tragic character who is just presented as an Orientalized villain in, you know, Disney's Aladdin. So it's playing with that, not only in the war of, you know, that's happening in the distortions of factual discourse, but the war that is ongoing with, you know, fiction, because fiction is a very powerful tool, and it's trying to take back what has been written about us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's fascinating. I can't wait to read those.
If I can ever do it, you know.
To bring it back ever so slightly, just to thinking about journalism and reportage in your own career, what are the sorts of changes, either in practices or approaches, that you've seen? And then what also do you imagine as the future or some of the trends going forward? What would you like to see as the new journalism as it takes shape in the future?
I mean, the trends for journalism are twofold. There's the really horrendous side, obviously, the clickbait listicles that, I started journalism, in 2009. I was working in it, and it's, you got your certain stuff, but these days, especially with the assumption, there's always this assumption that readers have a short attention span. I don't believe that. I think it's the content that's the problem. If it's a very interesting content, they will read it. Like obviously they'll stop if it's too long and they'll read it in the toilet later. It doesn't matter. So I think that obviously that trend of infantilizing journalism and making it shorter and digestible and meme worthy is a trend that I've obviously noted and seen. But I think what you're going to see more, because of urgency and demand and this question of misinformation, which is huge, and it's very dangerous. And I clearly have seen that in real cases, right? Like, I mean, the biggest one these days is the chemical attacks in Syria, which people are going to argue is a false flag, regardless of any facts that are available. And you have other things. I mean, the example that's, I think, very funny, but maybe I shouldn't say it's funny from my perspective, is the attack on Capitol Hill, right? Like, you have people, regardless of the fact that we all saw it, we all saw what was going on, and you have people saying, completely different things. It just shows you the power of misinformation. And I think there has to be a fine line here, because let's be honest, there are true conspiracy theories and then there are stupid conspiracy theories. A true conspiracy theory is something like Manhattan Project. A group of scientists working with military folk split the goddamn atom and created a bomb that can destroy the earth. True. Very true. And it's a conspiracy. Stupid conspiracies is, lizard men. You know what I mean? So it's trying to understand and unpack. It's not discounting that there are conspiracies which exist and we know them. I mean, lately there is the Pegasus, which is the Israeli company that hacked on, so many journalists. Israeli company funded by different, states and regimes that were hacking into journalists, and that's a conspiracy. True. And then you have other things that, you need to push back, which is misinformation, untrue conspiracies. So I think the trend is trying to figure that out, and what that needs is investigative journalism. I think what you're going to see more and more of is refunding and bringing back the investigative journalist that was wiped out the last 20 years, I would say, because a lot of the investigative journalism was downsized, right? Foreign correspondents or investigative journalists were eliminated. So I think because of the urgencies, because facts do not speak for themselves, you need to have excellent investigative journalists. And with what we're facing in the 21st century, which I think is a disaster of a century, you're going to need a hardcore investigative journalists that are on it, like tight. I think that's the trend, and I think it's a necessary trend. Less about, everyday listicles and more work on something, like, again, it's fascinating. I mean, it's just a thought I was having because it feels like, how they say history is cyclical. In a way, it kind of is, because when you have, those robber barons like back in the day, and you had the muckrakers. Well, we have our robber barons today. They just happen to go up into space. So we need our muckrakers, the journalists that hit them. hit them with, scandal and report and infiltration and investigation and outing. That's what has to happen. And I think, yeah, we're in that cycle, but I think it's worse now because of technology and how the resources is just so pooled into these, rubber barrels. So much more than what was in the 19th century. It's worse. So yeah, I think that's the trend. I hope that's the trend, but I have a feeling that's what it's going to happen because I think everyone needs it.
Also, speaking as someone and going off of what you just said, speaking of someone who's had a little bit, chance encounter with journalism, and we find that a lot of young people who are trying to enter the field of journalism, even comics journalism, find it difficult to get into right away in something like investigative journalism, and are invariably kind of enrolled into this listicle heavy kind of workload. So going forward, what advice would you give to aspiring journalists getting into the field of journalism?
I think they should just do. I mean, if you're interested in a story, just do it. And the only way you can learn, because I didn't go into courses for the type of journalism I did. I was just doing, like I just went to the person's office or just went and found myself in really silly situations because that's the way. You just have to do it. It's a trial by fire. It's something that you just need to go do it. And whether your editor accepts it or not, you just do it. And then you see what happens, right? I mean, there also has to be a pushback, and editors, I think, need to wake up as well because they're at fault. They're complicit. Because they're always worried about their ad spaces and, the person above. But editors, if they care about, actual journalism, they should be, encouraging the journalist to go find the story and figure it out. I mean, I think for me, I would say two things. Do it, just do. And two, don't write the headline first. Let the story speak for itself. Because I think it's much more interesting as you go through this unexpectedness and just hearing it, the story unfurls and you'll find things more than if you come with, here's the answer. But also at the same time, let the story speak for itself and then stick to that position. I think don't be biased, don't be objective and disconnected. You're part of it, I think those are the two quick thoughts. And thirdly, I would say is be weary of Yazan Al Saadi's giving advice on anything about life because he hasn't figured out anything. He's still lost. I do take heart, though. I have to say, I'm 38? I think I'm 38. I actually don't remember anymore. I have to share this story because I think it was actually a very nice thing that Joe Sacco told. And I think it's worth sharing. So when I met Joe Sacco, he was telling me how when he was 40, and this is after, Palestine, this is after fixture and everything. When he was 40, he didn't know if he could pay the rent the next month. That's the reality of this work. Imagine, Joe Sacco, who we all know, I'm like a Syrian guy living in Beirut, and you guys are over there, and we know this name. And he was going hungry. And he was going to quit. But he didn't. He just persevered. So I think the lesson there, at least, is that this is hard. This is hard work. And you're rarely going to make money. So there has to be something more in this. Because if you're just in it to make, bank, good luck. Good luck. But there has to be something more driving you. You have to have a politics. You have to have ideology of some sort. There has to be a bigger question that you're trying to find because it's not just a day-to-day job, which I think is true because I get it, Sacco. Yeah, I get it. I'm wondering if I should go into banking or maybe apply to McDonald's. Yeah, maybe. Imagine if I was flipping burgers at McDonald's. Oh my God, I would eat them.
Well, on that note, is there anything else that you would like to share after that uplifting conclusion?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I need to uplift it. I mean, but I'll add an uplifting because it shouldn't be dour. I mean, regardless of all the hardships and all that stuff, I mean, it's comic journalism, right? And it's fun. It's amazing when you see the work come out in ways, especially when you're working with an artist and what they can just do on the page. It's worth it. That's what, like, I mean, that's what drives me. It's just having fun with this medium, seeing the work come out, being like, oh, someone read it and liked it. That's a cool experience. That's worth more than $1 million. That tiny thing for me is quite profound. And don't let my parents hear that because they'll be like, you're crazy. You should take that million. But I think that's part of it. And again, it's all about the bigger question because I mean, not to sound weird, but why else are we all here? We're all on this earth. There's nowhere else. We don't know if there's an afterlife, so we gotta just do something, you know? And I think the more of us that does something, there's a chance. There's a chance here for survival, which we need to think about.
That's a much better ending.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry. I can get very dour. I mean, it's the dark humor in us Syrians.
No, it's great. So again, thank you.